Hello world, and welcome to What Does This Knob Do? As you can see, this is the third episode, and I already posted the fourth. Why this? While I was working on my third episode, Francesco Mulasano of SoundMid asked in the official VCV Facebook group, who is interested in testing a module that officially does not exist yet and makes a video about it? Guess who couldn't resist? SoundMid is a sponsor of the VCV Facebook group and now also a sponsor of a new oscillator developed by Autodafé. If you haven't seen it yet, it is here in my YouTube channel. The third episode continues with oscillators. I've been thinking for a long time in which order I should discuss the modules, and I've decided to go plain alphabetical. So I think everybody can live with it. But each rule also has exceptions. So I take modules that match other modules as soon as the corresponding modules are reviewed. As you might guess, these are especially the modules originally designed by Mutable Instruments as hardware for VCV-Rack. Their code is open source and therefore there are some versions of different developers for VCV-Rack. Exactly with such a case, I will now start with cycles of Apelson's parasites, which corresponds to both the tidal modulator of audible instruments as well as splash of South Pole and South Pole parasites. The original module is Tides by Mutable Instruments, which also comes with a variety of firmware in the hardware version. Tides is, like all Mutable Instruments modules, very versatile and not really unique to any function. Tides is an oscillator, but also an envelope generator and an LFO. Depending on what I use it for, the handling is of course different. The firmware makes Tides a completely different module, and these versions are also provided by the VCV-Rack plugins more or less. For this reason, it makes sense to compare the modules with each other. But I want to limit myself to the use as an oscillator in this episode. I discuss the other functions in the associated episodes. Even in terms of optics, it is noticeable that both cycles and tidal modulator are strongly oriented towards the design of the original module, while Splash has a slimmer appearance with smaller buttons. Since space in VCV-Rack is not necessarily the problem right now, and on the other hand, even the smallest buttons can grow with the zoom function, it is only a matter of taste which version you prefer. Two of the modules are the same as the original module, with the added option of the alternative firmware sheep, which is also the name used by Audible Instruments, while South Pole calls it lamps. The two versions of parasites contain, in addition to the original, the variants 2 bumps and 2 drunks. Cycles even provides the optional quantizer and is thus very close to the Parasite's firmware. But let's take a look at the 4 modules with the original version. I have initialized all modules, so all modules have exactly the same setting and receive the same signals. Therefore, the sound should be the same at every module. We will hear and see that this is not necessarily so. Unfortunately, I do not have the hardware version as a reference, but for me it does not matter which module sounds more authentic. As so often, it is a matter of taste which sound you like better. But let's take a closer look at the modules. I would like to start with the inputs and outputs. Each module has 4 outputs, which are outlined in gray or black and therefore can be quickly identified. For the moment, I use the output B, bi, which of course stands for bipolar. This means that the signal goes into both the positive and the negative range. Specifically, these are between -5 and +5 volts. We see this in scope in the blue curve. The lowest peak is -5, the top +5 volts. Uni stands for unipolar, so the signal is only in positive range, here from 0 to 8 volts. Very nice to see here in the red curve. In addition, however, the signals of both outputs have absolutely the same waveform and also serve to convert a bipolar into a unipolar signal. To demonstrate this, I connected the LFO1, which is currently on uni, to the level input of the oscillator. We can see in the display the clearly unipolar blue original signal of the LFO and the resulting red curve, which is clearly bipolar. If I switch the LFO to bipolar and use the output in the oscillator, the result is unipolar. Needless to say, that sounds completely different depending on which output is used. Because of course, it is also possible to use the signal to further modulate or combine the outputs or split, or the possibilities are limited only by the imagination limits. And then there are still 2 outputs. High is a unipolar signal which reaches its highest point at the end of the attack phase and remains there until the cycle starts again or the curve is re-triggered. If one uses the signal for modulation, here I have fed it into the volt per octave input. The signal is only modulated during the sustain phase, as shown in the red curve. The signal of the low output is also unipolar and reaches its highest point at the end of the decay release phase and remains there until a new trigger pulse triggers the wave again. In the region of the control signal, a kind of gap arises in a modulated signal. That means it changes cyclically both the frequency and the amplitude. Of course, all outputs can be used simultaneously, and by contrast, the inputs are almost self-explanatory. Trig is for a trigger pulse that triggers the signal. In any case, a signal must be present if the module is to act as an envelope generator. Clock is intended for synchronization with an external clock. A trigger signal on the freeze input keeps the signal at the value it had when it received the trigger until it is triggered again. FM is the usual CV input for frequency modulation, the influence of which can then be adjusted via the corresponding rotary control. The level input I have already briefly described above, but in principle all types of modulation signals, control voltages, can of course be fed. Finally, the three sliders shape, slope and smoothness each have a CV input to connect an external modulation source. What these regulators all do, I come to that soon. Before that, it is important to deal with the buttons. With the top one selects the mode. 3 modes are available: attack decay envelope, green LED, attack release envelope, red LED, and cycle mode, LED off or yellow. For the 2 envelopes, a trigger pulse must be connected, otherwise nothing will happen. For operation as an oscillator, however, only the cycle mode is relevant. To see what the individual controllers do, I initialize all the modules once again. We all see the same triangular wave. With the frequency control, I can control the pitch within ±4 octaves. The transition is fluent, and the input, volt per octave, can also be used as a CV input, which is why it is probably also called the module cycles frequency. For all modules, the lowest possible frequency is 1 Hz, with the upper limit for the South Pole modules at 255 Hz and for the other 2 at 262 Hz. Thus the South Pole modules do not quite reach the C4. Whether that bothers, everyone has to decide for themselves. Let's go back to the middle position. As with the most modules, this works with a right click on the button. To test the frequency modulation, I connected the initialize LFO1 to all modules, so they all receive the same signal. In the frequency analyzer, we see that this time the 2 parasites show a nearly same behavior and the 2 with the original firmware. Parasite modules are more stable in both low and high frequencies, and it is also a matter of personal preference if that is relevant. I disable the EFM again so we can see better what happens to the signal. Although with the shape controller, the difference between parasites and original is not to be overlooked and also not to be ignored. The frequency spectrum also shows more high frequencies in the parasites. The same applies to the intermediate steps. Only the triangle is the same for all. Slope control works the same for all modules. Its main task is an envelope mode, where it is responsible for the balance between rising and falling. More about that in the corresponding episode. For the sound of the oscillator, the slope provides a kind of division of the signal, with a knob left, the upper part of the signal left and the lower right. But this is inverted, which is not heard. If we look at the frequency spectrum, the signal is symmetrical. Smoothness is in the initialized setting in the middle position, a sure indication that the signal can be changed in both directions. In the neutral position, we see a triangle wave. If we want to smooth it out, we turn the knob to the left. And slowly, the triangle becomes a sine. And then, almost a flat line. On the other hand, the signal becomes rougher. It gets rough edges. The curve is folded. The farther the knob is turned on, the more folds are added, and thus more overtones. Generally speaking, smoothness is removed or added. It seems that the smoothness controller works the same way for all modules. Let's see how the identified differences in the interaction of the individual components are noticeable. All knobs are all the way to the right side. It's hard to see in the scope, but there seems to be a difference between the original and the parasites, which is to be expected because the shape controls add more high frequencies. Although with the shape slider to the left we have the same result, and as expected, all modules sound the same when the knob is in the middle. Also in the analyzer we can see that the frequency response is the same for all settings as soon as the shape slider is in the middle position. And of course, it gets really exciting when modulation comes into play. Let's get to the alternative firmware sheep or lamps. While owners of the hardware have to decide which version they want to install or, of course, buy the module several times, the users of VCV-Rack have it much easier. A right mouse click on the module and the check mark on the desired option is all it takes to make the tidal modulator of audible instruments or splash of South Pole a wavetable oscillator. Both modules now also have this term in the header. The two versions of parasites do not have this option, but there are 2 bumps and 2 trunks modes, but more on that later. If the module is used as wavetable oscillator, some elements of the control surface change. Bi and uni remain the same. The low output becomes sub, and here a square wave is output, the frequency of which is output 1 octave below the original signal set on the frequency knob. At the high output, a 1-bit version of the original signal can be tapped, which of course has a beautiful lo-fi aspect. For the further consideration of the functions of the controllers, I let all 4 outputs run in parallel and initialize the module again. Here we see, from top to bottom, the bi signal, the uni signal, the sub signal, and the 1-bit signal. With the top button, you select the sound bank. Green LED is called additive harmony. What this means we'll see soon. LED off stands for pulse width modulated waves, and red LED for waveforms of the WMAP table of mutable instruments, oscillator braids. In VCV-Rack, the macro oscillator of audible instruments, and cornrows X of South Pole. With the button below, you can select the frequency band between low, green, mid, off, and high, red, with a fine tuning again via the frequency button. The FM button also has the same function, just like smoothness. But things are different with shape and slope, which are now called row or column. The name actually says what these buttons do. It's about rows and columns. We know this name from tables, and a wavetable isn't something else. Rows are parallel to the x-axis and columns are parallel to the y-axis. So each waveform within the wavetable has exact coordinates that can be adjusted with these knobs. Of course, that does not mean that you really know the coordinates to select a particular waveform, because the transition in both directions is fluent. In principle, one could say with the wavetable PWM, with row one selects a family, and with column how far the selected family member in the kinship is apart. If we take a sinusoidal wave, we get that if both row and column are at the left end and the LEDs are off, then row changes the signal, e.g. to a pulse wave, other family, while column retains the fundamental curve but adds additional frequencies and thereby distorts the signal. In the upteenth generation, the original curve is still to be guessed, but actually the signal has become a sawtooth. In the case of the pulse wave, this means different pulse width, so to speak, a PWM. When I select the bank WMAP, at the beginning, coordinate 0, 0 is a sine wave. Column duplicates these and increases the frequency. But a sine wave is still clearly visible. Exciting here are above all the intermediate steps in which different degrees of intensity, that means sine waves with the same frequencies but different amplitudes, arise. On the one hand, the signal seems to be thinned out. On the other hand, however, clearly more overtones can be heard, which give the whole a phased or metallic character. When turning the row regulator, it is noticeable that the individual rows have a stronger relationship here. After a few steps, I already achieved the same result here as with a PWM at the end of the column. But this signal is also reproduced by the column control. And here we even hear chords in the intermediate areas. We come to the green LED and thus to the already mentioned additive harmonics. Here I have a quasi sine wave if the row controller is in the center position and the column control on the left stop. If I turn now on the column controller, high frequencies are added. With the row control, I determine the number of overtones, starting with a very dull signal on the left, up to a quasi sawtooth on the right. Here too, interesting, especially metallic and percussive tones can be represented. Is there a difference between lamps and sheep? Except for the fact with a frequency controller, which I already mentioned at the beginning, not really. Both the graphical evaluation and the acoustic impression cannot determine. All in all, lamps sheep is an outstanding sounding and extremely versatile oscillator, which of course is only expressed through external modulation via LFO or other sources. Finally, we come to the two parasites variants. Two bumps enables additive synthesis by adding sine waves of different frequencies and amplitudes. The outputs are configured as in lamps sheep, except for uni, whose signal mixes the harmonics randomly and thus introduces an interesting random element into the sound. A trigger on the freeze input triggers a new mix. But in any case, the uni output must be used. A trigger on the clock input causes a new distribution of the harmonics, but only with the moment when the trigger arrives. Then the curve is as before. A trigger on the trig input causes a reset of the current curve, so it restarts with every trigger pulse. For a gate signal, this is perceptible as a shift in phase. The two switches also have another function in this mode. The top chooses the kind of harmonics. When the red light is illuminated, only octaves are added. Green, odd harmonics, and LED off, all harmonics are included. To hear and see this, we first need to press the smoothness knob, because If it is in the middle position, shape and slope have no function. To get an optically visible signal, I turn frequency, shape and slope to the left stop and move smoothness to the left until I almost have a sinusoid. The signal is barely audible, but good to see. If I move shape or slope slowly to the right, whole tones, mainly octaves, are added. With the smooth control, I choose how the timbre is affected by the center frequencies selected with shape and slope. So I can select two dominant mid frequencies whose amplitude is thus increased. The second frequency is always less emphasized than the first. In the initialized state, I have a C5 according to hot tuner of nicety. This does not change if I change the nature of the harmonics by pressing the appropriate button, even if it sounds like that. If I turn red and move the frequency slider to the left stop, it becomes a C1, as one might expect. I move shape and slope also to the left stop, nothing happens. No surprise. However, if I move smooth towards the left stroke, less and less the adjacent frequencies of the main frequencies set with shape and slope are emphasized. One could also say that these are filtered out or subtracted. The curve changes until it becomes a pure sine, in which only the main frequency sounds, which is acoustically barely perceptible at C1. And finally, the amplitude of this frequency is lowered, so that only a flat line remains. So we have no signal, so bringing an emphasis through the controls shape and slope does nothing. Amplified silence remains silence. That's the sound of silence. The situation is different with the sine wave, as we saw earlier. If we move the shape slider towards the center, we hear very well the intervals, and also hot tuner shows us this. But if we reach the next octave, shows hot tuner again as C1, and we hear it that way. Because though the first overtone of the fundamental frequency, or the second harmonic, was added. The same is true if more octaves, say the other harmonics, are added. Unlike drawbar organs, I have here but also the intermediate frequencies, and can also emphasize these to get a different sound. In short, with shape and slope, I select my two emphasized main frequencies, and with moves, I control how much the adjacent frequencies are affected. On the left of the middle position, the main frequencies and their neighbors are emphasized. To the right of the middle position, first the main frequencies and then the neighbors are faded out, so that only a few frequencies are heard at the right stop. The basic function of the controls, shape, slope and smooth, of course remain the same, but the other two modes offer completely different sound spectra. Let's take odd harmonics mode and leave the smooth slider in the same position as before. If the shape and slope are on the left stop, then we have a pure sine wave again. I move the shape slider to the right. I select again frequencies to emphasize. In the octaves I have a pure sine wave again. Or if in both shape and slope an octave is selected, the frequencies cancel each other out and I have a flat line. But between the octaves it becomes very interesting. The waveform becomes chaotic and contains all sorts of frequencies and timbres. If I move the smooth controller further to the right, I no longer have a pure sine wave. So there are also different frequencies in the octaves, so that there are always partial cancellations, which results in interesting sound spectra. If no LED is lit, we have the entire spectrum of harmonics. If we start from the pure sine wave again, then we get natural tones during the rotation of the shape controller, a la Thus Spoke Zarathustra, whereby these are more strongly separated with the shape controller. The transition is more fluent with the slope controller. By combining the two controllers, very clean intervals can be displayed. If we change the output signal with moves, this consists of numerous different frequencies, as clearly seen on the spectrum. Very nice. Here you can see the two selected frequencies and the influence of the smooth controller. If both frequencies are still strongly separated at the beginning, this loses more and more as the bandwidth of the affected neighboring frequencies increases. Until the middle position, no separation is present. If we turn the knob further to the left, you can clearly see the hole that is forming when the frequencies are fading out more and more. One last option is still open, namely the second button. This adjusts the quality, that means the accuracy of the sine waves. Red LED is the highest quality, so as you can see, here is a beautiful round curve. In contrast, the green LED with the lowest accuracy, which is noticeable in spikes in the curve. If the LED goes not light, we have medium quality, so only slight kinks in the curve. Of course, all three variants also bring differences in sound. The more angular the curve, the more it sounds like a triangle wave. That means sharper or colder. But are there any differences between the two modules? The most striking thing is certainly the different tuning of the two oscillators. So the frequency in the middle position of the frequency controller is at cycle at 523 Hz C5. At 2 bumps it is 509 Hz, and thus between B4 and C5. However, this seems to be a known problem according to GitHub, which resulted in converting from VCV-Rack 0.5 to 0.6. Now let's take a look at the version 2 drums. At South Pole Parasites, this is also the name of the module, and the individual controls describe how it works, with cycles, One must remember which function the regulators have in which version. 2 drunks is also called dual random walk simulator, roughly speaking 2 probability generators. The 2 generators are each randomly clocked with an independent clock signal. Channel 1 represents a trembling or fluttering whose intensity can be adjusted. Channel 2 simulates a random coin toss, whereby the probability of the output can be influenced. The low and high outputs output these clocks, respectively. They are both derived from the same master clock, with the frequency knob controlling the frequency of this master clock. Each step of the clock generates a voltage at one of the unipolar channel 1 or bipolar channel 2 outputs. The course between the steps can be selected with a shape interpolation knob. The transition between the waveforms is fluid, so that not only classic shapes such as square wave, triangle or sine are possible, but many mixed forms. If I move the controller from left to right, you can see clearly that the signals of both outputs change in opposite directions. I have the square wave at channel 1 at the left stop, at channel 2 right. The reason for this is that both channels share the same parameters. In the middle position, the shares are the same, that means 50-50. The ratio changes by turning the knob to the left or right. This applies to all buttons. The smoothness slider sets the maximum size of a step, but within these parameters, step sizes are random. The slope knob adjusts the behavior of the 2 clocks. For channel 1, it acts as a random delay of the main clock. The knob is on the far right. This equates to 0 delay, and channel 1 follows the main clock. Turning the knob to the left increases the random delay, and the clock slows down and begins to flutter. For channel 2, it controls the likelihood that a tick of the main clock produces a tick of channel 2. Completely left is the probability 1, and the signal follows exactly the main clock. The farther it is turned to the right, the more ticks are deleted. In the middle position, the probability is 1 to 2. Rightmost, the probability is very small but not 0, and almost all ticks are left out. As usual, the FM knob is an attenuator for the CV input of the same name, but it also has a second function which refers to the 2 random clocks. For channel 1, the random distribution of on and off states is set. For channel 2, the pulse width of the clock signals. The module has 3 modes, which are set with a mode switch. When the LED is off, it runs cyclically. The main clock keeps ticking and stops only when a gate is received in the freeze input. When the LED is green, the module is in trigger mode. A new cycle is started only when a trigger is received in the trig input. Also, the trigger is triggered at the clock outputs of channel 1 and 2 delayed random. If the LED is red, it is in gate mode. The master clock is cyclically switched as long as the input value at the trigger input is high. The range button adjusts the frequency range of the oscillator as usual. Low, green LED, medium, LED off, audio rate, red LED. 2 trunks is also a very interesting noise generator. If you set the range to audio frequency and boost the frequency to maximum. These are the